Hello and welcome to Good Evening Britain, a Force for Good's weekly show, coming to you live from our studios here in the heart of the great British city of Glasgow, with me, your host, Alistair McConnachie. We are broadcasting on all our digital platforms throughout the United Kingdom and across the world. We're bringing you quality, pro-UK comment and analysis every Wednesday from 7 until 8 p.m. on Facebook, on YouTube, on Twitter, and on TikTok. Folks, please do tell us where you are viewing from. Please do send in your greetings and do send in your questions, because this is the show where we're British, we love the United Kingdom, and we want to stay together. And if that's you, please keep watching, and if that's not you, please keep watching anyway, because you might learn something. Now, we are teleprompter free, folks, and we have a fantastic guest coming on at the bottom of the hour at 7:30. It is Ben White, who is going to be talking to us about his experiences as a Scotsman living in England, and also his thoughts on Humza's hate law, or you might say Humza's hateful law, certainly his anti-free speech law, which we learn is coming into law on the 1st of April. And it's been a long time in the making. It was started brewing back in 2020. It was passed into law in 2021, and apparently it's taken 3 years for Police Scotland to try to understand what on earth it's all about. And we're going to explain exactly what it's all about. In 20 short minutes, we are going to look at the law, we're going to explain what it's all about, and we're going to tell you about the dangers that we must all be watching out for. And that will take us to our guest at 7:30. Now, let's have a look at some of the people who have come in. Nice to see Debbie. Debbie was first in tonight, says good evening Unionists, followed by Derek Hart. Says good evening AFFG family, I hope everyone is well. Hello to Melissa and to Catherine Rainey, great supporter, and to James. And to Nelson Norman, says good evening all fellow Unionists everywhere, and good to see Dominic in the house. And Alexander Cameron says, I've got to say I loved David Griffith's interview with David Curtin. I think he's part of the Scottish Heritage Party. Well, David Curtin was on the show a few weeks ago, and he is a great chap. A great chap indeed. Hope he stands a lot of candidates at the general election. Hello to Alan as well. Folks, if you're watching on YouTube, please do hit that thumbs up button. If you're watching on Facebook, please give us a like and a share. If you're watching on Twitter, please give us a repost so that more and more people may know about us, because we're speaking about a very important topic tonight. It's Humza's anti-free speech law, otherwise known as his hate speech law. And we are going to tell you all about that. Nice to see folks coming in also on TikTok. Good evening to everybody on TikTok. Tepis says, how are you doing, Alistair? I'm well, I hope you are too, sir. We are Scotland's premier pro-UK campaign group. Good, good. Now, let's get straight to the meat and potatoes of tonight's show, because this is a very important topic. Back in 2020, Humza Yousaf was the so-called Justice Minister, and he brought forward a bill which he euphemistically titled the Hate Speech and Public Order Scotland Act Bill. And he asked for people's opinions on it. And we spent a considerable amount of time responding to the public inquiry on that particular matter. And we wrote an article which I'll just bring up here. And it was called Free Speech for Scots. And here it is here. And we really kind of went round the houses with this one and covered all particular matters and the dangers of such a thing. And we made 4 recommendations here, which we'll talk about in greater depth. And right down at the bottom as well, we wrote a qualifier for them, which was that if they were going to bring this in, they needed a strong freedom of expression clause in order to ensure that people were not going to get caught who had no intention of doing any harm. And we wrote it for them in 6 paragraphs, and we based the freedom of expression clause upon a freedom of expression clause which exists in the Public Order Act 1986, Section 29J and Section 29JA. And we also based it upon US law and also on the Code of Canada, Section 3193. Defences for freedom of speech. And that's a really important defence that we recommended they include in their law. Needless to say, they didn't include any of that, and we'll be talking about that in a moment. Now somebody might say, well, Alistair, who are you to be making freedom of expression clauses and expecting the Holyrood executive to take note of you? Well, I'm an interested party, and I've also got a degree in Scots law, which I achieved as a mature student. So in that sense, I know how to write laws like that. Now, let's look, however, what then happened was 2021 rolled along. Now remember, this is during COVID, and one of the last acts of the Scottish Parliament was to pass this law, and they passed the law on the 11th of March 2021, and that was during a period of lockdown, and there was only 2 protesters outside Holyrood that day, myself and a colleague from A Force for Good. We were the only 2 protesting, and we did a video on that day, and we also put up 1 or 2 posters which the police told us to take down, which were basically saying, Humza says you've had a bit too much to drink, to think. Humza says you've had a bit too much to think. Anyway, there it sat and did nothing for 3 years until we discover this week that it's now going to be brought into law on the 1st of April 2024. So suddenly it's got real. Okay, stuff has got real, and this is now happening in a real way. So we need to know what it's all about. And that's why A Force for Good is here to explain to you. Now, the title of the bill is the Hate Crime and Public Order Scotland Act 2021. Now, the first thing that we need to know is, what is a hate crime? The Scottish and English prosecution services have slightly different definitions. The English one is from the Crown Prosecution Service that says, quote, any criminal offence which is perceived by the victim or any other person to be motivated by hostility or prejudice based on a person's disability or perceived disability, race or perceived race, religion or perceived religion, sexual orientation or perceived sexual orientation, or transgender identity or perceived transgender identity. The Scottish executive definition which we discovered in one of its brochures, is hate crime is the term used to describe behaviour which is both criminal and rooted in prejudice. Now, both those definitions are a bit abstract and a bit obtuse and unclear. So we're going to clarify it for the sake of the Crown Prosecution Service and for the Scottish Executive to say that what you were trying to say there is that a hate crime is a crime aggravated by prejudice. So that's our understanding of what a hate crime is. It's a crime aggravated by prejudice towards a person because of their real or perceived attributes. Now, when we talk about a hate crime, in our heads we have to separate two very distinct things. Okay? There is what could be called violent hate crimes, and there are hate speech crimes. So a violent hate crime would be, for example, a gang of youths of one particular colour ganging up and beating a youth of a different colour. And if there was racial prejudice there, then that could be called a hate crime. That's a very serious crime. It involves violence, potential injury. That is really quite a completely different matter from what could be called a hate speech crime, which is somebody using language in such a way in certain circumstances which is perceived to be hateful. So these are two different things. However, you will notice when the government or when the police or when the media talk about hate crimes, they lump everything all in together. So they'll say something like hate crimes are increasing, and you're thinking that violent crimes regarding race are increasing, and they might be, but you think, is it that many? But what they don't tell you is a lot of those crimes are not the violent hate crimes, they are hate speech crimes, which are of a much lesser import. So the media and the system does tend to blur the concept of hate crime, but there are serious differences between a violent hate crime and a hate speech crime. So that's something to be aware of as we further explain the situation. Now, the next thing that we need to know is, what is aggravation? If you steal somebody's items, for example, that's burglary. If you steal that person's items and you have a weapon, that's aggravated burglary. It's burglary aggravated with a weapon. If you mug somebody, that's mugging. If you mug them with a weapon, that's aggravated mugging. If you mug somebody at the same time as using racial slurs against them, that's racially aggravated mugging. You are considered to be demonstrating a dislike or hostility towards that person on the basis of the person's race. That's racially aggravated attack, which is different from simple attack. It's, in the eyes of the law, an aggravated mugging is considered to be worse than a normal mugging. And the concept of aggravation in an attack, verbal aggravation, is a relatively recent concept, and it was introduced in the UK by the Crime and Disorder Act 1998. So it's a recent innovation. And it was racially aggravated attack was introduced, as I say, in 1998 relatively recent innovation, and when it happened there was considerable debate about whether or not this was the correct thing to do, whether or not this was a moral, philosophical, right thing to do. And some people said, no, mugging somebody is bad and it's evil, and it's just as evil regardless of what you happen to call them when you did it. Anyway, that there is such a thing now. It was the people who argued that lost the case, and there is such a thing as racially aggravated attack. And when you look at a lot of these horrible videos on Twitter, it does seem that there is such a thing as racially aggravated attack. It does seem to be a real thing. And of course it's often white people who are at the end of that racially aggravated attack. So it does seem to be, unfortunately, a real thing. But as I say, those sorts of hate crimes should be distinguished from the ones that we're talking about here, and the ones that this Humza's Hate Speech Act is largely about, which is hate speech crimes, not crimes of violence. And there is a big difference. The hate speech concept came after the racially aggravated violent crime, hate crime concept. Once that came into law, once they said that race can be an aggravating factor in a violent attack, once that came in, they then brought it into the concept of speech. They got that idea into law. They said that a crime could be aggravated by prejudice, or what they are calling hate. And they moved further to the idea of the expression of prejudice in certain circumstances could itself be a crime. Okay, so they moved the goalposts considerably to the point where they claimed that the expression of prejudice in certain circumstances could itself be the crime, regardless of, even though there was no other circumstances, even though there was no physicality, even though there was no physical harm, even though there was no physical loss, the actual expression of prejudice in certain circumstances could be a crime. So the offender didn't need to commit a conventional crime, such as a violent crime. The offender simply needed to express a prejudice in certain circumstances, and that would be a crime in itself. So what are those circumstances? And this is important to understand. Some people may think that using a racial slur, for example, is the crime. That's not actually the crime. The crime is only committed when those words, when that racial slur is intended to or likely to stir up hatred. It's when the slur, or whatever the words, the prejudicial words used, are connected directly with the intention or the likelihood of stirring up hatred. When you have those two things together, then you have the crime. It's a very subtle distinction, and it's not at all clear whether the judges themselves understand that. It's certainly not clear whether the juries understand it. It's not necessarily clear whether the police understand it. It's a very convoluted legal concept that what we call hate speech is using threatening or abusive or insulting language with the intention to stir up hatred or the likelihood of stirring up hatred. And if you get convicted of that in Scotland from the 1st of April, you could be facing up to 7 years in prison. So this, and we'll look at the we'll look at it in a little bit more depth in a moment when we run through it, but why is this a controversial subject, a controversial legal concept? Why is the concept of hate speech a controversial legal concept? Well, legally, it's a crime that's difficult to pin down in court. One, it requires us to consider what is and what is not prejudicial language. It requires us to consider what is threatening or abusive or insulting language. And that's very often a matter of opinion. It then requires us to prove whether that person intended to stir up hatred. Which then requires us to consider, well, what does stirring up mean in practice? And indeed, something that's not properly defined is what even is hatred in law. And then if we decide that he didn't deliberately intend to stir up hatred, he can still be caught on the hook of, was it likely to stir up hatred? In other words, he can be caught on something that he had absolutely no intention of doing. And that conflicts with all British law to date, by which I mean all English law and all Scots law. In Scots law, we have a tradition called mens rea, M-E-N-S, second word R-E-A. It's Latin for guilty mind. And if you commit a crime, you must be shown to have the mens rea. You must be shown to have the guilty mind. So what this is doing by saying that we're going to convict you, even if you had no intention of doing it, that's a complete contradiction of that age-old Scottish law of mens rea, that age-old Scottish concept that to commit a crime, you have to have the guilty mind. So this is allowing people to be convicted without having had the guilty mind. It's allowing them to be convicted just because it may have been likely to have stirred up a hatred, which they never intended to do. So those are the problems that face us in law. But secondly, the biggest objection against hate speech law is that it is a political concept. There's no question about it. It's a legal concept intended for the political purpose of control, silence, and suppression of legitimate political debate. Because the fear of being accused of such a quote-unquote crime can stop people saying what needs to be said in order that they're able to do what needs to be done. There's a lot of things that need to be done, for example, with immigration, a lot of things that need to be stopped. And quite a few people, not ourselves as such, but other people might be afraid of articulating that for fear that somebody might find it insulting or might find it quote-unquote abusive or even threatening. And for fear that a jury will then find them guilty of being likely to stir up a hatred which they never intended to do. So it's a political means of control. That's, as far as we can see, the main purpose of hate speech. And so, having said that, let's just quickly run through the bill here. Hate Crime and Public Order Scotland Act. Aggravation of offences by prejudice. This part looks at who is a potential victim. This part speaks about racially aggravated harassment. Now that's generally something that most of us could avoid getting entrapped in, although you could see how that might affect neighbours, for example, who don't like each other. And if you're complaining about your neighbour could perhaps say that he was being harassed by you on the basis of race. But the big one here is part 3, offences relating to stirring up hatred. And here we see a person commits an offence if the person behaves in a manner that a reasonable person would consider to be threatening, abusive or insulting, or communicates to another person material that a reasonable person would consider to be threatening, abusive or insulting. So that could simply be making a Twitter post. But here's the thing, and the above has to include, in doing so, the person intends to stir up hatred, or a reasonable person would consider that behaviour to be likely to result in hatred being stirred up. There you go, that's where you get caught on it. And that refers particularly to race, colour, nationality, citizenship, ethnic or national origins. And there's a second one here, which is very similar to the first paragraph, but it has got rid of the likely, and it only concentrates on the intended. And that's when the victim can be characterised by age, disability, religion, sexual orientation, transgender, or sex characteristics. You know, if we go to here, and we'll bring our guest on in just in a couple of minutes, but if you go to this one, a person commits an offence if the person behaves in a manner that a reasonable person would consider to be threatening, abusive or insulting. Well, you know, some people would say that Humza Yousaf behaved in a somewhat insulting manner when he gave his famous white speech about all the white people in Scotland and positions of power in Scotland. So some people would say that maybe Humza Yousaf could get caught there under Part 3, Section 4. Because while I'm sure Humza had no intention of stirring up hatred, perhaps a reasonable person would consider the behaviour or the communication of the material which he spoke to be likely to result in hatred being stirred up against such a group. The group here being defined by reference to race and colour and nationality and ethnic or national origins, or otherwise known as the white Scottish. So, you know, maybe Humza Yousaf himself could get caught under that law, which would, of course, be kind of ironic and also ridiculous. But maybe, obviously, we're being tongue-in-cheek there, but it's also very serious because this just shows the subjective nature of this particular law which is being brought in. The subjective, not objective judgments which the police, which the judge, which the juries are meant to consider. And so it seems almost like an unworkable law, but it is serving its purpose, no doubt, which is to scare people into silence on many issues which need to be spoken about. Time will tell. This won't be the last time we're talking about this particular issue, but time will tell how this is going to go. Now, it's the bottom of the hour. I want to bring on our guest, who is a fellow called Ben White, who runs a Twitter page called The White Opinion. And let's bring Ben on right now. Please say hello to Ben. Hello there, Ben.
Hi there, how are you?
Good. Thanks very much for joining us tonight. Now, this is the first time you've been on the show, and we first found you on TikTok when we came across several of the videos that you were putting out, mainly speaking about what it was like to be a Scotsman living in England, and also your opinions on matters the sorts of matters that we talk about here on this show, which is to say keeping the United Kingdom together, which
Sure.
you were all for, Brexit, restriction of immigration and things like that. So you definitely came on our radar at a very early stage, about 18 months ago. Would you just like, by way of introduction to the viewers who won't have heard of you before, just tell us how you came into the political topic of speaking about these things?
Yeah, sure. I never intended on being any sort of voice. However, I've seen the state of Scotland over the last 15, 16 years, and it was the pandemic when we've seen that these emergency powers not given back to the people, and the lockdown protests. I ended up going to those and made a couple of videos on TikTok, which went up pretty big, and ended up speaking about sturgeon after those, and then it became something from there. It was an absolute accident, and that account actually no longer exists either. It was censored.
Okay. Any reason why TikTok would censor your accounts?
For being pretty much outspoken. Things that might that hate crime act certainly would get me in trouble for, and I think that's what it was. The last thing that I posted was to do with the Gaza conflict, and then my account suddenly was no longer there. So to be quite honest with you, I'm not really interested in like numbers or things like that. You know, it was a complete and utter accident there, and it's done me some good not being on that app anyway, because I felt like I was in the thick of unbelievable amounts of negativity, and it became not a very nice place, that's for sure.
When you say under a lot of negativity, where was that coming from?
Usually from Scottish nationalists.
They
didn't like to know that their Führer Sturgeon wasn't who they thought she was, and just generally those people are people who don't seem to think for themselves, quite honestly.
Yeah. Well, we've been on TikTok for at least a couple of years now, and I know what you mean about the negativity. Eventually, they tend to go away. You know, the kind of they swarm in and then they swarm out when they see they can't really make an impact upon you.
Mm-hmm. It almost became a challenge. I was almost thriving in their negativity. You know, it almost became a challenge to wind those people up, which was counterproductive to any sort of thing that I was talking about at the time. And I think that's what that app is designed to do. I called it a weapon once, and I really still stick to that to this day. It's a weapon on people's mind and consciousness, and it's definitely designed to pit people against people.
Interesting thoughts on it. You could well be correct. This is saving grace as far as we're concerned, is that it does allow different, more views to be heard on it than, for example, on YouTube.
Sure.
You can hear, but these accounts often do get then taken off, but then people come back with them again. But there does seem to be a little bit more freedom of speech, as it were, on TikTok than there is on YouTube. However, I would say that there's a lot of bad stuff on TikTok as well. We wouldn't
Especially
go quite so
for the young children.
Oh yeah,
the dancing and the degeneracy, and it's being beamed right into their eyeballs.
Yes, and the more you watch a particular type of video, the more that gets shown to you as well.
It's certainly one of the most aggressive algorithms out there on any of the social media platforms. It intentionally pushes exactly what you want, and if you want hate, it will give you hate.
Yes.
And I think a lot of people get lost in that, and I was becoming one of them. It was becoming absolutely counterproductive to any of my beliefs or who I am as a person. Falling for it just as much, yeah.
Oh yeah, absolutely. One likes to think that one's able to protect oneself from that sort of stuff. but if you can sit back, you can see that you're just getting taken along with it as well. So yeah, it sounds like you've made the right decision. So, do you live in Scotland?
I don't. I actually live in England.
Right.
I've lived
And
there for just over a year now, and I can see myself living here for the rest of my days. For absolute certainty, I will be here for the rest of my days.
okay, crikey. Any particular reason why you'd be so determined about that?
I have nothing in common with the Scottish people anymore.
Right.
And in 1 year of being in England, I have more in common with these people than I ever have with a Scottish person, to be quite honest with you.
Well, I mean, what's the main kind of difference then that you're finding? Like, if you moved down a year ago, what was the main impact that you found about England rather than Scotland?
I won't say what town I'm in, but I'll
No.
say that it's a historic town where the bricks are held together by pride, not mortar. That's what I'll say. The people are very proud. People, flags, Union flags, all over the place. Not a pride flag to be seen.
Mm-hmm.
Proud people, and it's a small town as well, so they're very community driven, and everyone knows each other, and it's like one of those movie set English towns that you see. It's exactly like that. It's almost a complete 180 from anything I've experienced in Scotland.
Right. Yeah, that's interesting. That's interesting to know. The problem with the Scottish nationalist debate is it was something that was always under the surface, and Scots got along fine with each other so long as you didn't talk about that. And when I was growing up in the 70s and 80s, you were aware of that debate, but everybody's like, well, we're not going to go there because it's just going to create too much friction between people. And unfortunately, thanks to, well, whether it was inevitable or not, but certainly the Scottish Parliament gave that tendency a platform. And that brought about 2014, the referendum, which unfortunately caused a social division of sorts. And I don't want to overplay it, but it did definitely divide people to the point where some people started to look on each other as like, what side's that person on?
Yes. You almost became an enemy to your people unless you agreed with the nationalists. You became an enemy to your country and an enemy to your countrymen for daring have a difference of opinion.
Yes. Well, Derek, please don't move to England because we need you here to help us in Scotland. Which is actually one argument that I would say to people. Is like, if people say to me, oh, I'm thinking about moving, I was like, don't. Who's going to help a force for good?
I know the optics of fleeing a country. However, I felt like a refugee. I felt like I was being pushed out by these nationalists. Not that I'm saying that they had anything to do with me moving to England. That's obviously a joke. But you almost feel like anybody who is Scottish and feels like keeping this country together, come down here and see what you're missing. You'll be you'll be welcomed. You won't be treated like a second-class citizen in your own country. And the people actually care about each other.
Yes. Well, you're painting a very rosy picture there of England, but I should imagine there'll be parts of England which are considerably worse than living in Scotland as well.
Yeah, I'm very lucky to be in this sort of town. I know, like major cities and stuff are currently under an immigration crisis. In fact, it has started to appear here. It's not like this town's shielded from anything of the sort. In fact, it's the opposite. However, for now, it's on a good steading. It really could, it really is on a good steading. England's attitude towards Scotland, however, is absolutely positive, and that's one of the things that I've kind of surprised people with. Is I'm not an Anglophobe.
Well, tell us about that then. England's attitude to Scotland, as you see it.
There is actually a few families. They've moved down 10, 20 years ago as well. Not in this town specifically, but they do come to this town. They all said the same thing, that they would never go back to Scotland. The attitude of the Scottish people towards the England is one of 1314. It's the one of the radicalisation programme they went through on the lead up to the Scottish independence campaign, with Braveheart being shown on their screens every single night. And it's the one that they seem to still believe is their reality. In England, however, all I hear about Scotland is how beautiful the place is and how lovely it is. I don't hear about politics. I don't hear about anything of the sort. I don't hear about independence all the time. Independence is like a bizarre concept to them because they're fighting the same enemy, the Tory party. That's what they're fighting. Scotland, you're either with them or you're a Tory. In England, it's exactly the same, but with the Labour Party. You're either voting for the Labour Party or you're a Tory.
Mm. Yes, the Tories are the bogeyman for all the other parties, and everything is measured against the Tories as the ultimate, which is kind of ridiculous, really, because when you look at the policies now of Tory and Labour, I prefer the George Galloway phrase, the uni party.
Yeah, absolutely. I was just about to say the same thing.
Yes, yes. Yeah. And so I'm hopeful perhaps that the uni party might break, really, because I think it has to break. I don't hold any more to the idea that you've got to vote for one to keep the other out, because they're both going to be largely the same, and I don't know what your thoughts are on that.
Well, I did hear someone the other day say that they're voting out, they're not voting in, but it's one and the same thing. They're voting for the exact same thing, wrapped up in a different package. It's the same thing.
Yeah. Sorry, go ahead. No, I was just going to say, did you hear what I was talking about there regarding Humza's hate speech law?
Yes.
Do you have any thoughts on that?
Absolutely. Scotland is one of two countries in the world where you can be jailed for speech, apparently. The other one being North Korea. That's not a great comparison. And I've said it before in a few videos, but I love saying it. Scotland's known for the greatest freedom fighting force the world has ever seen, but they've been succumbed to words and hurt feelings, and that's a real shame.
Yes, it is, and it's a lot to do with the devolved institution as well, and the fact that it allowed the people, such as the Greens, who are behind a lot of this, it allowed them positions of power. And because the Parliament itself wasn't really doing much else of particular importance, they were able to concentrate on all this kind of social engineering. They've had the luxury to basically sit under the power of the British state and just create all this devilment. The devil will find work for idle hands to do. Absolutely. As the phrase says, and as long as you are enjoying the largesse of the great British taxpayer, then you can sit and fiddle about with all this micro-social engineering for the worst, and that's one of the reasons why we've got it in Scotland. Having said that, all of this nonsense as well comes also from the British government as well. I'm not saying it would be any better. And it's only marginally better at the moment. But it too will succumb to all of this nonsense.
I believe that Scotland is England's experiment. Not England as in the English people, but I do believe Scotland is used as a testing ground for many things. Many things. And that this will be yet another one of these things. Because the idea of speech being policed is absolutely foreign to English people. They had no idea that that's even a possibility.
Yes, indeed. And what worries me as well is how easy it is to get trapped into something like this. If you're a young person at school or...
Yeah, exactly. School playgrounds for sure are are certainly going to be, well, it's going to change anyway. It's definitely going to change now that they'll be armed with this power, where kids' education, their entire lives or futures will be destroyed by accidental speech, and that's not good. It's obviously not very good at all. A criminal conviction for something like hate speech, like you were saying earlier, that where it could be conflated with violence, is unbelievable. And these kids are actually being taught that speech is violence in some instances. America's certainly getting that. I know here it's like that as well, where some places they're teaching that speech can be violence. Some of these organizations are saying that speech can be violence, and that's absolutely insanity.
Yeah, and they make all sorts of convoluted arguments,
mental
gymnastics to end up in a terrible place where somebody's dead.
Yes.
Which is just not. Which, if that were the case, you couldn't go through life saying anything, lest you ended up doing that. So we do see them saying such things. And
one thing from being on TikTok I realised was the amount of people who are afraid to speak out in Scotland. The amount of people, the messages I would get saying that I'm saying things that they've wanted to say, and that kind of stuff where they don't think they could speak out. But if you are, like, people that are speaking out are now going to have to be in very extra careful, be extra territorial with what they're saying, essentially, because of, let's say, immigration, for example. Now, we know it's all a hot topic right now, but what happens if someone gets offended by saying that the countries may be full?
Mm-hmm.
Is that going to be policeable? Because all of that seems unpoliceable and unreasonable.
Yeah, well, if you was to say there's too many Syrians coming in on small boats, or too many people from Albania getting into the country, or something like that, that could be considered. And it doesn't need to be an Albanian that takes offence at this. Okay, if somebody heard me saying that on this show, and they said that, I find that to be insulting, and I find that to be racially prejudiced against Albanians. And what they would have to do, of course, is to prove that I intended to stir up hatred, or that it was likely to stir up hatred. So, as I mentioned when I was speaking about that, that is the connection that does have to be made.
Sure.
Okay, that's the leap that has to be made. But in this society, that's a fairly easy leap, unfortunately, for a lot of politically correct judges or confused jurors to make.
Because they're calling themselves reasonable people. But these people are anything but. What is a reasonable person? Who determines who's reasonable or what's reasonable? And unfortunately, the people that are going to be policing these laws and sentencing people are not that reasonable.
Yes, that's right. Reasonableness definitely changes with the times, and and it has no particular legal definition other than what is considered to be the societal norm. And so if the norms shift to the point where even saying something like there's too many Albanians coming across on small boats, if that could be considered by some people to be likely to quote unquote stir up hatred, when of course there's no intention of doing that. It's just a matter of political fact that I would like to stop the number of people who are coming across in small boats. And I use the Albanian example because there's absolutely no reason on God's good earth why Albanians should be getting refugee status in the United Kingdom. Okay, there's nothing going on in Albania that they're needing to be escaping from, so that's a complete con that any of them are coming here. So I use that as an easy example, but the point is that anybody can get caught out
Sure.
on that. And we saw the recent example of the fellow Sam Melia, who got done, and his stickers said things, just basic things that weren't in and of themselves even offensive, but clearly somebody found them insulting and considered that it was likely to, or intended to, stir up hatred. And
Sure.
he got done. He got 2 years for that in England. So
I think he was made an example of. It was almost used as the deterrent for, this is what will come to you if you dare speak against us or out about anything about that.
Yes, absolutely. Budgie Burger says too many illegals smashing up the free 5-star hotels. Yes.
Yeah.
So
when talking about the illegals, sorry, I think they're just equally being used as pawns by politicians as well. Like, people have to remember that there's a lot of hatred going towards anyone that's a different colour, a different shade of white to them. It does go too far sometimes, where I still wouldn't agree with policing it. However, the rise in the media seems to be conflating a lot of racial hatred on the, GB News in particular. It seemed to be drumming up a lot of racial hatred subliminally, or off the cuff comments, etc. And it's given justification for people to then start being that way as well. But then you slap that kind of thing in front of them as well, then they can go to jail for it. When in their mind they might have only been speaking out for what their country, for their country. Now they're in jail for it.
That's a good point. And we need to help the people like ourselves who are opposed to basically the invasion of this country. We have to help educate them about what the laws involve and how their casual speak can actually catch them out in a very bad way. And
in England, English people use, just like Scots and English, they're so similar. Like, that's one of the main things about living in England. What I've noticed is they're so similar, and football chants, and like you were mentioning, the idea that they could then be jailed for that is like, it just genuinely does not make sense to them. It doesn't make sense to them, and I think that's what it is for a lot of people. Like, policing speech, that's nonsense. Policing thought is actually what some of it reads like. Actually,
yes.
Thought policing.
Yes. Yeah. Well, it is a form of thought police. Thought policing. There's absolutely no question about it. Hate speech policing, and the big danger, of course, is that this gets conflated into as if it's a violent thing in and of itself.
And I'm not saying speech can't equate to, speech can't cause violence. Speech can obviously cause violence, but to equate speech and violence as one is essentially double speak. It doesn't make sense.
Yeah, it should be pointed out, of course, that if you incite violence, I mean, that's always been against the law. If you incite to a violent crime, that's against the law, and that should be against the law, because nobody should be doing that in our democracy. There's laws against that, and you can't say that is a political tactic in order to suppress debate. It's simply just keeping the law.
It's completely superfluous. One of the things in that as well is the abolition of blasphemy. The blasphemy law abolition. Godlessness is exactly why our country, or one of the reasons why our country is in the state that it's in. And immigration, everyone's a Muslim apparently, right? Well, Muslim people do go to the mosque, and they do follow their text. And right now they are doing Ramadan right now. And I keep hearing that English or British culture is being lost, but it's being lost by our own people because they're not subscribing to what it is to be British. They want to say it's a white Christian country, then walk the walk. Because I'm not seeing a lot of men in the churches. What I'm seeing down here is a lot of churches that can't afford to get Bibles on their pews because nobody's walking through the doors. They're in the pubs instead.
Yeah, it's a good point. I hear that one of the advantages of this particular hate speech act was, at least it's abolished blasphemy. I was like, I'm not sure that's actually a good thing. I mean, I think we should be
antithesis
showing respect to certainly the Christian religion and passing respect to the heathen religions, as I like to call them, in my controversial way,
Yes.
whether or not that calling those other religions heathens.
That might be now,
that might be from
end up in
1st of
Humza's
April. I
back
may have
pocket,
to.
Yeah,
Yeah, I may have to.
I'm sure that will be clipped and used in Police Scotland's investigation.
Yeah. Ben, we need to get you back on. I think you make a great person here to bounce ideas off of. But it's the top of the hour. So,
Sure.
Folks, do say a big thank you to Ben. If you want to follow him, he's on twitter.com/The White Opinion. And no doubt we'll be hearing from you.
Alistair.
Go ahead.
But that's maybe another thing under Humza's law, that if I was to live in Scotland, that might get me locked up, is even the implication of my username on Twitter. The White Opinion.
Yes.
When it's actually about my surname.
Yes, indeed. Well, I'm sure Humza could do a whole speech on that, on white Twitter handles.
Yeah, oh yes.
Like the one he did recently.
In Hollywood,
okay.
Yes.
Yeah, good. Okay, Ben, fantastic to speak with you. And
thank you very much for your time, and everyone's time. Really grateful for that.
Absolutely, Michael. Ben, Catherine says, thank you, Ben, you were fantastic. Totally concur. Michael says, thank you. Derek says, great chat. Another great show. And,
and this
good
is
stuff.
A great show, Alistair. Like, what you've got going on is excellent. Like, it's really, really excellent. And that's one thing that I've seen on TikTok. It really caught my eye was how professional your show was, and how into it you are, and how into what you've got going on. That's really rare, man. People are usually just in this for themselves, and you really seem like you want to help people, and that's awesome.
Thank you very much for those kind words, and I couldn't do it without all the supporters here at A Force for Good, our assistant producer of this show, and our social media coordinator who helps especially on Facebook, as well as, of course, all the viewers who watch and who send in their comments and to share and like the program. So thanks all of you, and thank you, Ben. We'll have you back on as soon as you're available.
No problem.
And
thank you again.
Good night.
No problem, sir.
Fantastic. Good to see Ben there. Excellent new guest on the show. And I think we had a good show tonight. I really do. Folks, if you are a new viewer and you haven't yet got our book, One Big Country, it's volume 1 of a projected 5-volume series. It's only $9.99. It's available on Amazon. All you need to do is go to amazon.co.uk and search for One Big Country. There we go. Check it out. It's what keeps us on air, is our merchandise sales. Talking about merchandise, we have totally revamped our clothing store, and we've got a lot of good ideas for new products as well. And more about that though next week. But in the meantime, it's at teespring.com. If you go to teespring.com and search for A Force for Good, you'll see so far 107 items, which is considerably up from the 25 or so which were there last week. And it's only going to grow, folks. It's only going to grow. The banner's still up. Let's give it let's milk that for One Big Country, folks. And if you want to help, a lot of people are helping from only 69 pence a week at our union supporters programme at aforceforgood.uk/union-supporters. Go there, you can sign up for 69 pence a week, which works out at only £3 a month. And boy, that definitely keeps us going as well, because we've got a whole team here that we need to be keeping, so that we can keep going. Brilliant stuff, folks. I'm currently working on issue 10 as well of Union Heart, and that'll be coming out in April, and that goes free to all our Union supporters, but you can get that at our shop -1, and a lot of good articles on aforceforgood.uk. We put up one yesterday as well about unionist opposition to the Union of Parliaments in 1707. And we revealed something that many people don't know, which was a lot of the so-called anti-union debate in 1707 was actually an intra-unionist conversation between different types of people who wanted a union of sorts, but were arguing over how best to do it. And that's something that you don't hear. That's something that the nationalist politicians and historians don't tell you. The extent of the pro-United Kingdom debate back then in 1707. So we're all over the place with articles, historical articles, hard copy magazines, hard copy books, including our wee book for the Union. Our wee book for the Union, which is, again, at our shop, aforceforgood.uk/shop-1. This is the one that really set us on the road. And we've now got our big book as well, which is going to become an even bigger book when the other 4 volumes are added. Volume 2 will be coming out in November of this year. Folks, we cannot be stopped. We cannot be stopped. Okay? Our team is committed to this fight. So, whether you like us, whether you love us, or whether you don't, the thing is, you're just going to have us, because here we are, and we're not going anywhere with your support. With your support, folks. This is Scotland's foremost pro-UK campaigning group. If you want to join us on the streets, our summer street stall programme will be beginning in April. If you want to join us on the streets, please do contact us, and you can come out with us at our street stalls. It's going to be an exciting summer. Looking forward to it as well. It's going to be an absolutely fantastic summer. Great stuff. And check out all our stuff at aforceforgood.uk/shop-1. And if you want to appear as a guest, contact us as well. If you know people that want to come on as a guest, like the fantastic Ben White that we had earlier, if you know people, please tell them to contact us, because that's our job, is ensuring that the pro-UK patriotic voice is heard throughout the United Kingdom and indeed the world. Brilliant stuff. Absolutely brilliant stuff. As James says, we go from strength to strength, always developing, always creating, always getting better and better. So, let's bring our show to its conclusion. Thanks to all the viewers. Over 200 people watching tonight. Absolutely fantastic. That's a real boost. That's a real boost for us. When we see those kind of views, we know we're doing the right thing, and it really does help. So folks, it just remains for me to remind you that we'll be back next Wednesday. Until then, God bless the United Kingdom, and God save the King. See you next week.